Hello, I'm Dr. Pierre Simon, and it's great being back with you as we continue in our series of embracing the unfamiliar, navigating that fear of the unknown, that scary what's going to happen next type thing, or what's around the corner type thing. Those whens, whys, and all those questions we tend to ask to figure out what's going to happen next. Well, for some people, that's not a bother, especially if you're an extrovert. Hey, that just doesn't bother them at all. They jump right into things and off they go. But for most others, the fear of the unknown, probably about 65%, I would say, let's be conservative, half of the population has a significant fear of the unknown. Mentally and emotionally, fear is understood as a response to perceived threats. And it plays a critical role in keeping individuals safe by triggering the fight or flight response. Remember, we've talked about that in the past. I keep repeating it because it's important to get this in your mind and keep reminding yourself of it, because we have two parts. We think of the right and left hemisphere of the brain, but there's the upper room and the basement of the brain. So there's the top half and the bottom half also. If we think of that basement of the brain, that's where the fight or flight center is located. And that fight or flight center, or the limbic system of the brain, we need that. It's important, but we don't want to dwell down there. It's kind of like staying in the dark basement for too long. What's going to happen? Your thoughts are going to get a little messed up. So as a kid, laying in bed, staring at the open door of the closet, and it's dark in there. And if you stare long enough, you start imagining things coming out of the closet when you're a kid, and sometimes when you're an adult as well. So we don't want to dwell in the basement of the brain. We want to bounce. So bouncing is important, bouncing out of the basement. When there's a threat perception occurring, whatever that threat might be, we bounce into the basement. We go into the basement to react. Do we need to fight? Do we need to run? Do we need to freeze? What do we need to do? Does the adrenaline, the stress response, the hormones, does that need to activate to make us stronger, to get us to do whatever needs to be done? But you know what? If we dwell down there too long, what happens? It gets worse. We get worse. Imaginations start to run in a adverse direction. We don't want to dwell down there. We want to bounce out of the basement. So if we need to hit the brakes in a hurry, great. That's what we need that for. But we want to bounce out of there and calm down as quick as possible to make the next important decision of where do we steer the car. If we stay down there, we're not thinking about where do we steer the car. We're in panic mode if we dwell down there. What tends to happen is anxiety increases, fear increases, self-protection, the need to protect self increases. So fear and apprehension, self-protection, selfishness comes out of the basement, not from up there, it comes from down there. Whatever else, anxiety, depression, those other kinds of things, they're all coming out of the basement. We want to bounce out of there, get back up top to the upper room where your good thinking is located. So your right thinking, good thinking is located in the top half of your brain, where the frontal lobe, where you do all your detail and problem solving thinking, is located here, and it sends information back, gathering information and so on. Your right thinking, good thinking, is located right here, just behind the frontal lobe area within the anterior frontal lobe. And your conscience is located right next to it, where, as Christians, we believe the Holy Spirit speaks to us. God speaks to us through our conscience. It's easier to hear when you're in the upper room than it is when you're in the basement. It's easier to get those impressions of the right thing to do, the best thing to do, what God would want us to do. Are we going to get that in the basement? No, because selfishness is in the basement. Self-protection is in the basement. We're not thinking about what God wants for us. We're not thinking about what He's telling us to do. We're thinking about preserving ourselves. We don't want to dwell down there. So that's just a quick, not so quick, I'm sorry, but a reminder of that top half and bottom half. That's so important that I want you to keep remembering that so you can stay out of the basement, bounce when something threatening occurs. All right, go down there, do what you need to do, but bounce out, get back up to the good thinking. So mental and emotionally, as I said a moment ago, we don't want to dwell in the fight or flight center. And if we do, we're going to lose our jobs, we're going to lose our relationships, we're going to be unhappy, we're going to constantly be worried, we're going to do all sorts of negative things. I mean, the list just goes on. Do you want to live that way? I certainly don't. You don't have to. Bounce out of there. And to bounce out of there, we've got to work on it. Shakespeare's famous line from Julius Caesar says this: "Cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant never taste of death but once." Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? This highlights how fear can dominate one's life and lead to a symbolic death long before a physical death occurs. In Christian spirituality or Christian counseling, fear is often discussed in two contexts: the fear of God, rather obvious, and the fear of mental and the fear of mental and the emotional state, mental and emotional state of mind. The fear of God is considered a form of reverence or awe towards the divine, seen as the beginning of wisdom. And we can read that in Proverbs 9, verse 10, and other places in Scripture as well. This type of fear is not about being afraid of God in a punitive sense, but rather about recognizing God's omnipotence, His all-powerfulness, and the vastness of His love, which guides believers towards doing right, being right, living right. Proverbs 9, verse 10 that I mentioned earlier says this: "The reverent fear of the Lord," that's worshiping Him and regarding Him as truly awesome, "is the beginning and the preeminent part of wisdom, its starting point and its essence. And the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding and spiritual insight." It's not fear and apprehension. It's knowledge and spiritual insight of knowing, of respecting, of, we could say, honoring the position. On the other hand, fear as a mental and emotional state is frequently addressed in the Bible with admonitions to don't be afraid. Don't fear. What do the angels say when they appear to people in the Bible? First words usually coming out of their mouth: fear not. Don't worry. It's okay. It's going to be all right. Don't be scared. I got something to say. Hang in there. It'll be all right. This reflects the belief that faith in God provides strength and comfort, helping believers to overcome fear. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7 states, "For God did not give us a spirit of timidity or cowardice or fear, but He's given us a spirit of power." Another translation for the word power in the Greek is passion. He gives us a spirit of power or passion, and of love, and of sound judgment and personal discipline, abilities that result in a calm, well-balanced mind, thinking, thoughts, upper room part of the brain type thinking, and self-control. This verse suggests that fear is not from God, and individuals can find courage and peace through faith. If we think of faith, basically faith is confidence. I have confidence in God to do what He said He's going to do. I have confidence that this is going to happen or that is going to happen. I have confidence that I'll get through tomorrow, even though it's unknown today. In exploring fear within the context of spirituality, there's a duality. On the one hand, fear emerges as a barrier to spiritual development when it stems from attachment and a lack of knowledge, trapping an individual in the cycle of spiritual stagnation. On the other, fear assumes a transformative role, acting as a driving force towards spiritual maturation, growth, when it fosters a sense of reverence, imparts wisdom, and deepens faith or deepens confidence. This dichotomy highlights the intricate relationship between fear and spiritual growth. Which one do you want? Do you want to stay in the basement where fear is located? Do you want to go into the upper room of the mind, of the brain, where spiritual growth is going to occur, where developmental growth is going to occur? A compelling biblical narrative that encapsulates these themes in the story of the Israelites in the wilderness, especially as it unfolds in the Bible books of Exodus and Numbers. We hear this story all the time, but it's important to recognize it. The Israelites often succumb to fear, attachment to their past, lack of knowledge and understanding of God's nature and promises. This triad of spiritual obstacles repeatedly hindered their progress towards the promised land. Look how long it took them to get there, serving a stark illustration that gave us a stark example, an example that you can't overlook. It's so prominent in the Old Testament, the story of their wandering in the wilderness for so many years. It's spiritual stagnation. It's an illustration of spiritual stagnation. Sent to scout the land, most spies return with a discouraging report focusing on challenges and dangers, the unknown. They didn't like that part, rather than the promise of the potential for the land. Their fear is deeply rooted in an attachment to the known past. Think about that for a moment. Here they were in bondage, in slavery, and that was familiar to them. They knew what to expect there. The future was unknown, unfamiliar. They didn't know what to expect. And albeit their past was one of bondage over an unknown future, that requires trust and faith. And there was difficulty with that. This fear paralyzes them in the scriptures and incites a desire to return to Egypt. When we recognize that I'm familiar with what I do it well, it's okay, I have confidence, I'm going to do it well tomorrow because today I do it well, and in the past I do it well. But when you change that a little bit, you make an adjustment, you're not quite sure, am I going to keep doing it well? Is this wellness going to continue? Now I'm venturing into the unfamiliar. I'm starting to drop into the basement where fear and apprehension or worry is located. Self-protection is located. And if I dwell in that for too long, I talk myself out of the future. I talk myself out of doing this new thing, a new way, because, look at all the things that could go wrong. Well, that's what they were thinking at the time. Fear paralyzed them. It incited them to return back to Egypt. And that illustrated the attachment of what was familiar, no matter how oppressive can that history be, no matter how awful the past may be, it still brought them into wanting to go back there, deterring them from spiritual progress or growth. Coupled with fear and attachment is a profound lack of knowledge, not in an intellectual sense, but a relational and experiential understanding of God's character and faithfulness. Despite God's repeated demonstrations of provision and protection to the Israelites, understanding of God was a bit waning. It remained superficial. It limited their ability to trust in His promises. Now we read about those things, we read about all those miracles and those supernatural things that occurred, and we think, well, how could they be that way? Well, if we were there, we probably feel the same way. I don't know. But I'm thinking, if something great happens today, but something bad is happening tomorrow, I may be inclined to focus on not letting it happen again tomorrow for the next day. So I may start to forget the great thing that just happened, a couple of days earlier. I'd be inclined to self-protection if I focus on the basement of the brain and fear and apprehension. The what ifs might get the best of me. This lack of knowledge fosters a spiritual myopia or short-sightedness, where immediate challenges eclipse the eternal and divine perspective, leading to rebellion against God and a refusal to advance. No, we want to go back to Egypt. We want to go back to being a slave. We want to go back to that. If you think about it for a moment, domestic violence or domestic abuse cases, so many victims remain in the abuse for that same reason. The unknown is scarier. The unknown is more frightful. The unknown of what might happen tomorrow, or where am I going to live, or how am I going to survive, becomes more fearful than the pain, the suffering, and whatever else that might be going on in domestic violence. And what do? They choose to stay. They choose to protect the offender. They choose to allow it to go on. And everyone's scratching their heads. What's wrong with you? Well, it's a typical dynamic of that fear of the unknown, that fear of what is unfamiliar. The consequence of these intertwined barriers is a cycle of spiritual stagnation. How are you going to grow and develop in wisdom if you're staying in the basement, if you're staying in self-protection, fear, and apprehension? Spiritually, it's no different. How are you going to grow spiritually if you're staying in the basement, away from where you can hear the Lord a whole lot easier in that upper room, where your conscience is passing along the right thinking, the good thinking, the direction? Spiritual stagnation, where the Israelites' journey towards spiritual fulfillment and entrance into the promised land is significantly delayed. God's response to their lack of faith and trust is both a judgment and a lesson. Now, God's not striking them. It's not that type of judgment. It's an entire generation condemned to wander because of their choices. Their choices resulted in saying, I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready to face what's coming. God already knew what they had to face. He knew what they were going to have to deal with on the other side, and how they were going to have to be strong to fight the battles of whatever may occur. They weren't ready. They required more growth to face future adversities, with only their descendants allowed to enter the promised land. This generational wandering serves as a poignant reminder to the costs of fear, attachment, and a lack of knowledge on spiritual development. Overcoming these barriers requires cultivating a deep personal knowledge of God, fostering trust in His promises, confidence in His promises, and releasing attachment to past securities and fears. The journey of the Israelites is a powerful illustration of how fear and lack of knowledge can trap individuals in a cycle of spiritual stagnation. Still, it also points towards trust, obedience, and spiritual growth. Scholars like Harold Koenig have explored the interplay between spirituality and health, including how faith can mediate fear and anxiety. Confidence can mediate fear and anxiety. Koenig's work suggests that religious beliefs and practices can provide a significant source of comfort, resilience, and coping mechanisms in life's adversities. Theologians and philosophers such as Paul Tillich have engaged in existential fear, existential life, interacting with life, fear, distinguishing between fear of specific entities and more profound, diffuse anxiety of being, he called it, that religion seeks to address. Tillich argues that faith is the ultimate concern that transcends and transforms this existential anxiety into a state of courage. Confidence, faith, transforms anxiety into a state of courage. Faith serves as a linchpin in the transformation of existential anxiety into courage. Let me say that again, because that's important. Faith or confidence serves as a linchpin in transforming my everyday life, my everyday existence, my everyday interactions into courage. Have you ever thought of that before, that just simple faith can do that? Yeah, it's confidence. Yeah, if you believe in something strong enough, you'll have the passion to carry it out. Many New Testament examples vividly illustrate how faith is a transformative force, enabling individuals to confront and overcome existential anxieties with courage. Again, existential, interactions with life. Anxiety, fear, and apprehension. Getting out of the basement, back up there into where the confident zone is. Through these narratives, the New Testament conveys the power of faith to transcend fear, offering believers a source of strength and assurance amid life's challenges. Well, next time we're going to be embracing the unfamiliar and speaking of fear and its significance. I hope you'll join us. May your troubles be minor, blessings more, and happiness come through your door. God bless. We'll see you again.